All right. Took about a minute to get started. I'm wondering if somebody can hear me. It's kind of hard for me to tell what's happening. So um, let me go back in here and see if we can keep track of that. All right. Clifford, could you hear me? Is the microphone working? Oh, perfect. All right. So I'd like to get started right now. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope everyone, I hope I do okay with this technology. This is new to me, so I'm really aiming to do the best job that I can. And might be a little low. Okay, let me see if I can fix that. Okay. So is everybody seeing what I'm seeing right now? This says AP Bio Unit 7. This is Natural Selection, Darwin's Theory, Natural Selection, and Evolution. This is the college, the AP session for Unit number 7, the review session for Unit 7. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to get started by just doing some general housekeeping items. Below this video, and I apologize that I made a mistake yesterday and put the wrong thing, but below this video, you're going to find the slide deck information for this presentation, the schedule for the remaining sessions, and a place where you can submit some questions. So this is the way that I have been told to describe to you how to use this video. This is not going to be everything that it can possibly taught about evolution in 1 hour. It's just too much. Hundreds and thousands of syllabi and dissertations and classes have been taught about evolution, so there's no way I can do justice in 1 hour, but I'm going to try to cover as much as I can. This is supposed to be a way to refresh your memory about what you have done already, and for you to consider how Unit 7 might be incorporated into this year's exam. I realize that this year's exam does not have necessarily Unit 7 per se. It does not have any of this content directly, but believe me, evolution is the foundation of biology, so therefore we're going to have some of that stuff intertwined with the rest of the material. Some things to keep in mind is that I'm going to make mistakes. It's unavoidable, but please ask a lot of questions. We have 3 great people that are going to serve as moderators, and this is going to also give you a little bit of the capacity of asking and thinking about this unit and how it fits. So your moderators today are Christy, Martin Philippe from Indiana, Clifford Nefreda from Arizona, and Choi Soriano Manor. These are superstar AP Bio teachers, and I want to thank them for volunteering their time. So the topics is this might include, and before I do this, let me make sure that we're still looking good over here. Okay, let me continue. So everything's good. Here we go. Let me jump back in here. So the topics that may include, and this comes straight out of the College Board, it says that you're going to have to understand some evidence supporting evolution and common ancestry, the mechanisms of natural selection and speciation, environmental and human causes factors in evolution, human cause factors in evolution, charting species ancestry through phylogenetic trees and cladograms, extinction, and the models of the origin of life on Earth. So all of those may be included, and here they are right here. This is straight out of the College Board's CED. This is the reflection of what's going to be on that unit that we've been talking about. So before we get started with all of that, and I'm going to be using 2 different slideshows today. This was the one I shared. There's a second one I'm also going to share. The other one is actually not mine. But the purpose of using the second slideshow is for you to be able to utilize materials that are already available on the internet. And this happens to be materials from an incredible teacher. So I'd like to give him some credit, Mr. Knofke, and use some of his material and show you how I would use it. First of all, when we talk about evolution and evolutionary theory, I know that out of all the AP biology content courses, content material, this is probably the one that has the most controversy attached to it. But it's really important that you understand that dogmatic ideology is not science. So science has some very key elements to it, and I'd like to describe some of them for you. I always tell my students that you shouldn't believe anything I say, that anybody says, in fact, even if I said it, unless, like the goldsmith, you melt the gold that you have in front of you. If it's melted and you know it's pure gold, then you know what you have. Otherwise, you have to not believe anything that anybody says. So I also tell my students that science uses evidence or data as its only true currency. It doesn't matter who said it, how loudly they said it. All that really matters is what evidence you have to support your statements. And so for Popper, the definition, the demarcation between what is science and what is not science is simply falsifiability, the ability to be falsified. In that sense, evolution is not something that you believe in, but rather is a theory that has tremendous data that backs it up. And that's why we teach it, and it is the fundamental aspect of biology. So why do we teach evolution? Well, we teach it because it has relevance for all educational content. It is the foundation of modern biology, and it can be synthesized with every other discipline of biology, as well as geology and some of the physical sciences. Evolution is the way that we account for both the diversity and the unity of living things on Earth. It is verifiable, it is testable, it is a scientific explanation. I'm not asking you to avoid believing what you believe as far as your religion, if that's what you feel. But science doesn't use religion or dogmatic ideas to understand the world. What we do with science is we test it. So can science debunk or disprove evolution? Of course it can. The data has not shown that, but of course in theory it could. Finally, evolution's got staggering and continuous amount of evidence. It provides students with means to critically examine the world, and perhaps most importantly, because as was said in the 1970s, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. You're gonna see by the time we're finished today, at least is my hope that you see that evolution allows us to connect all other aspects, from biochemistry, cell biology, to molecular biology, to cell communication, and to ecology. This is the thing that connects it. This, by the way, is an image that is often used to represent evolution. This is wrong. There is nothing right about this, except for there are different people or different organisms here that all look like primates. This is not the way evolution happens. This is the way that we display evolution, and this is the more appropriate way to show how evolution actually takes place, just like this, okay? And so let me tell you a little bit about Darwin and why we use him as the anchor point for this theory. He shares a birth date with Abraham Lincoln, February 12 of 1809. He leaves on his boat, on the boat that took him around the world, the HMS Beagle, on December of 1831, and he spends almost 5 years. He spends 4 years and 9 months and 5 days going around the world, literally understanding what was happening and putting his ideas together. So he actually collected over 1,500 preserved species, 3,900 died species. He authored many different books, including the first time that he wrote this one was called Transmutation of Species in 1837. He wrote a lot. For example, he spent 8 years just on barnacles. Good Lord, he would have done okay with this quarantine time, I tell you. He presented alongside another famous scientist, Wallace, to the Linnean Society in 1858. And the origin of species, a famous book, was published on the 24th of November of 1859. He continued to study and write up until he passed away. So who is this guy? This is probably one of our most iconic images of this guy. That's him when he was young, and he was still bald. He was obviously, besides someone who was a scientist, he was a husband, he was a human being, and he almost became a clergyman. He was a geologist. He also was a pigeon breeder, and he was an eminent scientist. He was, for the most part, someone very humble and quiet, and he struggled for a long time to find the strength that it required for him to publish this kind of wild idea that all things are related. He studied at the University of Edinburgh. He wanted to be a doctor. He didn't like that. He finally got on this voyage that changed his life. This voyage looked something like this. As you can see, he leaves England, ends up going to the Canary Islands. He goes to Cape Verde. In Cape Verde, he goes down to South America. He goes around South America. He ends up in the Galapagos Island, where he does a tremendous amount of observations that lead him to his theory. So Darwin returned to England and was met with praise and accolades for his work as a naturalist. In fact, he was. He got married to his cousin, And he then went on to reshape the world in science by writing his theory. So a couple of things you should know before we get into Unit 7 here is that Darwin was not the first scientist to propose the idea of evolution. Lamarck had actually put this idea that changes in species was real, but except he had it. Lamarckism thought that the demands of the environment were linear and simple, and that was the reason for animals changing, organisms changing. Lamarck thought of something called spontaneous generation of organisms, and he didn't believe in extinction. And so there were some structures, for example, a very famous picture of Lamarck saying that giraffes basically, because the parents of a particular giraffe stretched their neck, their child would sort of carry that on. This is a famous picture that I found on the internet, which is pretty funny. It says a diagram below demonstrates, and clearly the right answer here would be that shorter giraffes would pass out. So this is Darwin's theory of evolution, but this student decided to write E, giraffes are heartless creatures. Okay, so aboard the Beagle, Darwin read Lyell's Principle of Geology, would help them a lot. His own experience with geological events and the fossil record were profoundly influential, and he understood some of what was happening with this idea of survival of the fittest because of Thomas Malthus. So this actually, a very famous picture, is one that I use as the icon for today's lecture. This, I think, testifies to the nature of science and the brilliance of Darwin. He writes on top, he says, I think, and then he draws a very early form of a phylogenetic tree. And we're going to talk about that. This is Wallace, the other man who presented with alongside Darwin. It's a picture of his famous book here on the origin of species. And you should be aware that Darwin was mocked for a long time because of his ideas. At that time in England, of course, the church was still very strong, and there was a strong relationship between man and humans being special and unique among all the other organisms. So a couple of quotes in here. Again, all of this is available to you, so I don't want to spend a lot of time with it because you could always take time to read. But what he did was this, and I'm going to leave you with this for this part. Darwin saw beyond what others had glimpsed, and he realized a couple of things. He observed that species produce more offspring that can survive, that there's variation with individuals and any population, and that those traits that help individuals to survive and then reproduce are the genes that are going to be passed on. Darwin did not talk in terms of genes. Darwin was not aware of the genetic work that was done at the time by another English scientist, which Mendel, which we'll not talk here. But the idea is this: there's variation that leads to adaptation, eventually selection, and finally evolution. And this is a quote from Darwin from the very last page of his book. He writes, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from such a simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." So thank you for that quick introduction. I want to get to using the content from Mr. Kanofsky, and the website, the link is found here. What I have done with this particular thing is I have modified it a little bit. Okay, so I'm glad that that's going on. Thank you guys for answering. Thank you for covering all this together. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna use Mr. Kanofsky's website. And what I did is I downloaded and I just modified it a little bit. He is fully aware of it, but I think that this website has just an awesome amount of material in here. And if you have not checked it out, I certainly would. I'm gonna open that up just so you can see it. This is his website. He has material for every unit. He is an amazing AP teacher, full of wisdom, knowledge, and skills, and he also is incredibly generous with his material. So for him, this was domain number 1, evolution, that's big idea number 1. And what you will see here is he's got all of the domains here. So I would beg you to take some time to go through his website. You're going to find some useful stuff. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over his website, his presentation of this unit with a couple of slight modifications. Before I do, I want to make sure that everybody's hearing me, that everything is good. All right, so it looks like we are on here. All right, perfect. Let me go on. So this is what Mr. Kanofsky calls domain number one. And again, this is from the College Board. 7.1 is natural selection. 7.2 is natural selection more in depth. Artificial selection, population genetics, the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, evidence for evolution, common ancestry, continuing evolution, phylogeny, speciation, extinction, variation in populations, and finally, the origin of life on Earth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some of these. We already talked a little bit about Darwin, that man, the legend, or as he's known in my class, Chucky D. So before Darwin, as I mentioned already, there were some people that were very important, including Lyell, Malthus, and Lamarck, who had some ideas that fed Darwin's understanding, his collection of ideas. As I mentioned earlier, the HMS Beagle went around the world, starting from England, going to Cape Verde, then to the south of Brazil, going into and around the Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, ended up in the Galapagos, spending some time, and went around the whole world. This was incredible. So what did he gain out of this? Well, the first thing he gained is he observed that there's variation. There's variation in any population. And if you don't believe me, next time you open a bag of beans in your house. Now, to me, beans looked pretty much the same until I started looking at them through the eyes of a scientist. Then I realized there's some beans that are just slightly darker, slightly larger, slightly more water dense concentration. So all of these variations exist in any population. Even when you talk about population of grasses growing outside, you're going to realize that individual plants, individual blades have some variation. So you notice that. No two organisms are completely alike. And here's a picture of, these are organisms that are from the same species, and yet there's a slight variation. He also noted that aside from variation, there's reproduction. Organisms reproduce. And most of the time, there's overproduction. In this case, he has a dandelion full of the individual little pieces which can, in theory, become a plant. And he also noticed this. He inferred that, well, there's different fitness. Fitness being the likelihood of survival and passing on your genes and reproducing. Some variations are just better than others at reproducing. And there's also this struggle for existence. So the other inference he had was over a span of geological time, now billions of years. It's really important that we understand that evolution has taken millions and billions of years. And the fact is, life on Earth is around 3.5 billion years old, bacterial life. And from that simple bacteria, we now have incredibly complex organisms such as yourselves. That takes time. And that's something really important that Darwin had to understand. Evolution doesn't happen in short amount of time. It takes time. I mean, we have some exclusions to it, but for the most part, Darwin's idea and brilliance came from understanding that Earth was old. So to develop the diversity we see on Earth today, the Earth has to be incredibly old. And if organisms are related to each other, we should have something as a common ancestor. In fact, most of your textbooks will probably list it as Luca, the last universal common ancestor, around 3.5 billion years ago. So we are starting to see that there's this tree thinking, that one thing is related to another thing, and that from that some different things came out. And so that really was Darwin's idea. A couple of things that were unsettled by Darwin. Darwin was brilliant. He was brave for what he wrote. But there were some things that he could not know. For example, he did not settle the origin of life. He didn't know. He also didn't really understand the origin of species or the nature of variation and inheritance. He did not understand those concepts. So now let me jump into natural selection, 7.2. As far as we know, natural selection's idea have been tested and retested the way that science works, right? So when a scientist proposes a theory or an idea, they publish a work, and she or he are then allowing others to test their hypotheses and collect their own data. And if the theory is not good, or if it cannot appreciate the new data that's collected, then we abandon that theory. That's the way that science works. More science is the way that we disprove science. And so here we notice now is something called a modern synthesis. Darwin's ideas have been fed into a larger theory, which now includes genetics and inheritance, which was not part of his original theory. This, by the way, the famous picture of some of the finches found in the Galapagos Island that he wrote tremendously about. So one of the things that Darwin did not understand is where traits came from. DNA would be almost 100 years later described in detail by the work of Rosalind Franklin and Crick and Watson. What we know is this is what we describe as a central dogma in biology. We know there's some variation here too, but DNA the information in DNA gets copied over into RNA in a process called transcription in eukaryotic cells that happens inside of the nucleus. And the information in RNA then gets translated into protein, and this translation happens in the ribosomes. Some of them are going to be attached to the rough and the plasma reticulum, and some are going to be free floating in the cytoplasm. And what we also know is that the trait, therefore, is dependent on the proteins. The proteins are dependent on information in RNA, and RNA is dependent on the information that is contained in DNA. We know that variation can come from mutation. Mutation is a change in the sequence, and it's happening all the time. Sometimes these mistakes are terrible consequences, so you can get a mutation that causes a cancer. Other times, however, they're going to be beneficial depending on the environment, or they're going to be silent and unnoticeable, really, because it doesn't change fitness. So mutations are created by alleles, and we know that alleles are different versions of the gene. In this case, we're going to simply, for an example, we're going to use brown eyes and blue eyes. And this is really important. One of the things that I tell my students from the very beginning is when they say, well, I don't know if I believe in evolution, I'll tell them, you need to tell me you don't believe that there's changes in the genetic frequency in a population over time? They kind of look at me, well, what does that mean? Well, that's what evolution actually means. Evolution is just that. Evolution is the change in the genetic frequency and the allelic frequency in a population over time. And each part is really important here. Change does not tell you whether it's going to be improved or it's going to be detrimental to the organism. It just says change. And then it says it's in the genetic frequency. It happens in the genes, and we know that it happens in a population. Individuals do not evolve. Evolution is not happening at the individual level. It happens at a population level, and we also know that it takes time. So one of the great examples here is the work that was done by Grant and Grant, who studied finches for many, many, many years. And what they did is they discovered that the beak size changed depending on the drought conditions, how much water was available on that island. And so the environment changed, and as a result of that, some beaks or some particular type of beaks were more prominent. There were more of them than others, and it would change. So that's what evolution is a change in genetic frequency in a population over time. And here's the actual data from the grants. Notice that they start collecting data way back here in the 70s. They go all the way to 2005, and I think they're collecting data still here. And here we have the number of large beaks. We notice that increases here at this time, and then it kind of goes down here. And then the pointed beaks, you notice that these pointed beaks are less here and much larger here. So we know that evolution happens. A couple of really big things that you should be aware of about evolution. Individuals evolve? No, we do not. Populations evolve. Evolution happens at the population level, not at the individual, and therefore I cannot evolve, not in the sense of biology. I mean, I can change, I can improve, but that's not the same thing as evolution. Evolution in biology is a very specific description. The change in genetic frequency in a population over time. And let's go now into how natural selection works. This is what we consider 7.2. So alleles in an individual have a particular trait. You know there are two types. There's homozygous, the same zygous, two copies of the same, or heterozygous, two different. These are two very important key words that you need to be aware of and you need to be comfortable using and understanding. So if I were you, I would write them right now somewhere next to you because we're going to go back to these in a minute when we do the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So homozygous, the same, homo meaning the same, zygous, heterozygous, two different. And we know that genotypes, geno meaning genetic, determines the phenotype, the way we look. The way that we show those traits depends on what genes we have. So we again understand that the genes are coded, pieces of DNA that code for a particular protein that eventually becomes a trait. So let's go for eye color. This is simplified. This is not really the way it works in humans, but for the sake of this example, Mr. Konofsky decided to use it, and I will too. Some alleles are dominant, they show up, and some of them are going to be recessive when you have a presence. If you're heterozygous and you have a dominant allele, that will be the phenotype that will show. The recessive will be hidden in the back. You still carry that gene, but you don't necessarily show it. So two alleles of dominant, you could either be big B, this is dominant, or little b, recessive, and you have two phenotypes. You can either have brown eyes or blue eyes. And in this case, we're going to say brown eyes are going to be big B. So if you have homozygous dominant, big B, one big B from your mom and one big B from your dad, you have brown eyes. But you can still have brown eyes even if you have a small b, because the big B is covering it. So heterozygous and homozygous dominant individuals look exactly the same phenotypically. We cannot differentiate these two phenotypically. However, if you're going to have the recessive gene, you need two copies of the small one, little b, and now you have the blue eyes showing. So in this case, both homozygous dominant and heterozygous show brown eyes, and we cannot differentiate them based only on their phenotype, and only the homozygous recessive individual has blue eyes. A couple of other things, another misconception alert that Mr. Konofsky pulls up is that dominant means better. That's not the case. Dominant alleles do not mean better. It just means that they has no effect on the phenotype. It just means in how they are displayed phenotypically. So, for example, having polydactyly, having extra fingers and toes is actually dominant. Doesn't make you better. It's just dominant. The same thing with dwarfism. It's a dominant trait. Again, not necessarily better. It's just dominant. So let's go. Before I go on, I want to again just check, make sure that everybody's looking good here. Some answers here. Okay. All right. Let me continue. All right. So fitness is the ability for you to contribute genes to the next generation, survive, and then pass those genes. And the environment does, in fact, determine fitness. Here's an example that Mr. Konofsky pulls out. There's the two examples here, but I'm going to, in this case, notice that there's an initial, all of these colors are about 20%, and then you notice that blue is significantly more percentage here, and yellow goes away, and over time you notice that that's what's happening, but red actually takes over. This is an example of a particular environment favoring some genes over the others. Same thing in here. You have pesticide, and for whatever reason it affects the white. There's more of them here, but it affects the white, and so now we have this percentage here. If in this case the whites are killed at a higher rate because of whatever situation genetically they have, you notice that evolution has taken place because the following population of individuals, the next generation, is different than the initial one. Now we're going to get into artificial selection. So that's natural selection. Natural selection happens because the environment has created conditions that favor some particular phenotypes over others. Those phenotypes that are favored get to pass on their genes, they get to go on dates, and they get to pass on those particular traits, which now those genetic frequencies are different than the initial population. The second here, 7.3, is artificial selection. And here we're going to talk about how humans can change that, how we can change the success, reproductive success of populations. And we have done it for a long, long time. One of the clearest examples that he points out is dog breeds. So we now have, even though these guys are both dogs, they're very different phenotypically looking. And that's because we have sort of forced that to happen by changing the conditions and breeding for specific things. Carrots, food items, we've done tons of that. Tomatoes, for example, used to be very small. Strawberries, very small. And we have bred them. We have artificially selected them to fit our needs. And so that's the way it happens. But we also know that evolution is driven by random processes. It is not just because of human impact. And here are some of those random processes. One of them is genetic drift, which is random, not selected changes due to chance. And so there are populations that just by chance alone, their allelic frequency changes. One of them is called the founder effect. So if I took my students from my AP Bio class this year, and they were lucky enough to go and colonize Mars, whatever genes are on that spaceship are the only genes that are there. And so if I take a population of all the students around the world that are taking AP Bio, but the only ones that get to go to Mars are the ones that are in my class, well, you're going to see that the founder effect is going to limit the population because that's where the founders, whatever genes are there, those are the genes that are there. A couple of examples is the Amish population and polydactyly, again, having additional toes and fingers. Another one is the bottleneck effect. So survivors of catastrophic events, such as what's happened before with cheetahs. It turns out that if there is a recovery, but it's very few individuals, whatever individuals are here and whatever genes they possess, they're the only ones that are going to be passed on to future generations. And again, here it is. Cheetahs are all genetically very similar in today's world because two bottleneck events. Another one is just gene flow, which is migration or emigration. One particular individual or a couple of individuals leave and they transfer those genes, they inject new genetic information into that genetic pool. An example of that is human migration. If you don't know who these people are in front of you right now, you're going to recognize this next person, though. Here's a darkly pigmented gentleman and a lighter pigmented woman. And we know that they're the same species because they can sexually reproduce, and their offspring is the 44th president of the United States, a sort of medium pigmented man that came out of that. Some other ways in which individual situations can, I'm sorry, that evolution can take place, that variation can be increased, is through sexual selection. In this case, sexual selection is some organisms are have those particular traits that allow them to be sexually reproductive at a higher rate. This one is the fiddle crab. Peacocks, for example, are females, and peacocks in this example, I think, is a great way to talk about the cost of sexual selection. In this case, peacocks are fancy. All these feathers are out there and they're showing off to the females. Look at me. Look how incredibly healthy I am. We should have some offspring together. But as he is displaying his colors, not only is he attracting the attention of the females, he might also be attracting the attention of predators. So there is a cost benefit, there's a cost ratio there. And it could be both intersexual or intrasexual, so it could be fighting among males, or it could be that just some are more attractive to the females. We know, for example, dancing with some of those birds of birds of paradise. Some of that dancing is very elegant and very exquisite, and it's very focused. And some dancings are better than others. Another misconception then is that evolution is random. Evolution is not random. It has random components to it, random forces, but the selective process is anything but random. Natural selection doesn't work randomly. It says if you have those traits that allow you to survive and do better in the particular environmental conditions, then your genes will be passed on. So we're now about halfway through it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with each and every one of these things, but I want to get to Hardy-Weinberg in a minute. Let me go into the evidence of evolution and common ancestry. What evidence do we have to support the statement that evolution is a theory that is a valid and scientifically sound theory? I'm glad you asked, because that's exactly what I would expect my students to ask. So we have some evidence. Some of that evidence is that the Earth is really old, 4.5 billion years old. That's an old piece of rock that's flying around the sun, around the part of the solar system. 4.5 billion years. Life doesn't appear on Earth. Our oldest fossil is, 3.6 or 3.8 billion years. And some of the ways that we're calculating that is we're doing that through carbon dating or through radiometric dating, which allows us to situate formations and fossils pretty accurately. So the Earth is pretty old. Humans, on the other hand, if you don't know how we might have been here, our estimates are somewhere around 200,000 years. 200,000, we just got here compared to 4.5 billion. Such a huge number, 4,500 million, and we're not even here for a quarter of a million. So we're just fairly new. Another evidence or evidential data group that is very strong is that we have a fossil record that is incredibly detailed. We have evidence of organisms that are no longer alive that roam the earth. We also know that living organisms, a lot of them resemble fossilized organisms. So we have that. And then we also have transitional fossils. In this case, Tiktaalik. If you don't know what this is, you gotta look this. This is amazing. This is one of these first or early fish to land organisms, and this was discovered up in the Canadian Arctic. And the person who discovered this, and well, it wasn't him, his team and his researchers are just amazing. And if you have not had a chance, you want to look up Neil Shubin. Just amazing stuff. We also have anatomical evidence. This is really weird, but we have vestigial structures that used to do something else and now are doing nothing, or something that doesn't seem to serve a purpose for our particular fitness. In whales, we find hind limbs. We have bones that were legs. So whales are mammals. That means that they came originally. They're related to organisms that left the water, came on land, and then went back to the water. Whales and also dolphins. So we have these vestigials. Even in humans, we have these things like our third eyelid. Our pharyngeal slits, our appendix, our wisdom teeth. These are structures that no longer serve the same purpose that we believe they served in the past. We also have homologous structure. Homo again meaning the same. In this case, homologous structures are structures that are the same even though they serve different purposes. If you look at forearms, actually arms of all mammals, you have the same exact structure. We have a long bone followed by two long bones followed by a bunch of little bones and then some digits. And that is the case whether it's a dolphin, whether it's a monkey, whether it's a human, whether it's a bat. These are similar. And in the particular one, we have a humerus, a radius, and ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. And for the lower extremities, we have a femur, tibia, fibula, tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. And so we have these. And it's really weird that the bat and a whale and a human have the same bone structures as far as that setup. We also have analogous structures. What this is different or organisms that do not have a close a close common ancestor that end up having similar structures that serve the same purpose. In this case, a butterfly can fly and a bird can fly, but they're not closely related because a bird, being a vertebrate, has bones, and the structure of the bones are what allow it to fly, versus a butterfly who is an insect and is not related because it does not have bones. Now, in the modern world, we also have some chemical evidence, DNA similarities and RNAs and protein sequences. We can now understand how closely related organisms are to each other, and this is really the most common way of looking at phylogeny or closeness relationships is through chemical evidence. At the time of Darwin, he had to base everything on or even Linnaeus, he had to base everything on structures that he saw, the observable phenotypes. So here it is. Chemical evidence has allowed us to create this incredible tree of life that sort of tries to explain it. At the very heart of this thing is going to be LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. And this one here separates. And so what you have here is you have bacteria. All of these are bacteria. And then here we have archaea, which, as you can see, it has a common ancestor closer to what eventually will become eukaryotic organisms, including animals and fungi and plants and molds. So another thing that's curious here is that animals and fungi are more closely related than fungi and plants. So all of these things are being described through evolution. It's just amazing. So finally, there's some mathematical modeling, computational analysis that allow you to look at sequences and then establish relationships. And one way that we can figure out or quantify the amount of evolutionary change is the Hardy-Weinberg theory. So let me go ahead and I'm going to skip through this very quickly about the code. I hope that you know this already, but this is something that should have been covered in the other units and something that you should be familiar with, which is protein structures are dependent on the way that the amino acid sequences are put together. We know that the universal genetic code, although universal is a little bit exaggerated, we know, for example, that mitochondrial genetic code is a little different. It's got different stop codons. And we know that the relationship, again, between prokaryotics and eukaryotics, prokaryotics being organisms that do not have a nucleus or membrane-bound organelles, versus eukaryotics, those organisms that do have a nucleus. And the reason why this is brought up here is because of this very important idea of endosymbiosis. Endo inside, sim the same, biosis living. So living inside the same. And so here, what we have is we have an idea that we have an early eukaryotic cell. We had a free prokaryotic cell that joins this cell, and over time they become so intricately related that one cannot live without the other. So every one of our cells that has mitochondria has, in fact, this mitochondria that has these little pieces. This theory, by the way, was written, I added this picture because she's one of my heroes, by Dr. Lynn Margulis. She was a big proponent of this theory. And I want you to understand that for a long time she was dismissed, I think in part because she was a woman, which is really sad. But what Dr. Margulis figured out is, number one, when you look at mitochondria, the shape, the size, the fact that they have their own DNA, they have their own ribosomes, would indicate that they are in fact prokaryotic of origin. And that is now what we understand as basic fundamental biology, the endosymbiotic theory. So we get to the Hardy-Weinberg, and this is where I think a lot of people get scared when they see math and evolution come together. But what is it? Well, it is a theory that allows us to see how much populations are changing over time from generation to generation. And it is an equilibrium, which means it's idealized. It was written by, and actually it was derived by two different people, by Hardy and Weinberg, obviously. And Hardy, as you may know, was an English mathematician who was involved in um, Ramachandran's ideas of math. So let me go on and tell you a little bit about this theory or this equilibrium. For Hardy and Weinberg, what they realize is that in science we don't ever prove, but we can disprove. So in order for us to test if a population is changing, what we need to do, in fact, is we need to test if it's not changing. And so a non-evolving population has these 5 characteristics. Number one, it's got a large sample size. That means that there's no genetic drift happening. Number two, that there's random mating. There's no sexual selection. Everybody is equally likely to have offspring. Number three, that the environment is stable. So there's no natural selection. One particular set of genes is not being chosen over another. Number four, there is no immigration or emigration. No one is leaving or entering this population. And number five, there are no mutations. This is just theoretical. No real population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, at least not for very long, because all of these things happen. I just went over the fact that they change. So what is the equation? The equations, and there's actually 2 of them put together, form the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. The first one is the gene frequency, which is P plus Q equals 1. And then the second one is the genotype frequency, P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. So what this shows you is homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and heterozygous. And I'm going to go over this sample problem. So here's a standard sample problem that you might see on the AP exam, and certainly you would see this in class. It says, in pea plants, the allele for purple flowers is dominant to the allele of white flowers. So if you have purple and white, purple is going to show over. The only way that you can have white is if you have 2 of the white alleles. And it says if 99% of the plants in the population have purple flowers, determine the percentage of heterozygous in the population. This is the information, the way that I present this to my students. These are the 5 steps that I ask my students to follow. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually put them to practice right now. First thing I ask my students is write both equations. P plus Q equals 1, P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. And notice that the P plus Q is really for alleles versus the P squared 2PQ plus Q squared is really if the information you're given is about populations or individuals. Step number 2, identify what you're given. Figure out what exactly you're looking for. Step number 3, if you're given the Q squared, which is quite often what you're given, the first thing you got to do is you got to take the square root and remember that the square root of a decimal is larger than that of the decimal. Number 4 is you figure out the Q by taking the square root of Q squared. And then Q here is the magic key that's going to unlock the rest of the variables. Finally, step number 5, work your way around it. So that's exactly what we're going to do now. And I'm going to use a whiteboard here to go over it. What I did is I wrote the equation here. So as I told you, the problem up here. As I told you before, what we're going to do is we're going to look at each of those steps that I mentioned. Step number 1 is to write the equations. I already did. P plus Q equals 1. P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. And I apologize that this 2 should not be a regular 2. This should be square, but it didn't copy that way. So I want to remind you also that this P up here, it's the same thing as saying, imagine that this P is the same thing as me see if this works. This P is in the same thing as big B. So big B. And so therefore, this is the same thing as saying little b. Right? So big B and little b. That's what that is. The other way is, think of it this way. This P squared, again, that should be squared, is the same thing as saying this is big B. Oh boy. I'm going to figure this out. Okay, here we go. No, those are lines. That's not what I'm looking for. Okay. I apologize. Okay. This should be. No, that's still lines. Oh boy. Okay. I'm going to figure this out. Let's see if I can do it like this. No. Okay. I apologize. I'm not sure exactly what those lines are all about. But they should work. All right, let's see. No, it's not going to work. So I apologize for this. Let me show you, since this is working crazy, I don't know exactly what's going on or why it's doing this. But now it's going to do this crazy lines. I'm not sure what happened here. But the idea is very simple. Even though I can't show you because this thing decided to act up, let me see if I can just do it here. I'm just going to create a new one here. And you're going to have to forgive my handwriting. It's pretty terrible, but I think that we'll be able to work on it together here. All right, let's clear all. Okay. So we have the equation one more time. And the equation looks like I told you. The equation is P plus Q equals 1. P squared plus 2. PQ plus Q squared, this is plus 2, equals 1. So this is our equation here. Okay, so let's go back. So what we're going to do is simple. This P is the same thing as saying, let's go with A. Big A, and this is little a. Q, P squared then becomes big A, the same thing as saying homozygous dominant. 2PQ is the same thing as saying big A, little a. Heterozygous, two different ones. And then Q squared is the same thing as saying little a, or homozygous recessive. So homozygous dominant, P squared, heterozygous, and a homozygous recessive. So the question here, we go back to it here, the question says, in pea plants, 99% of them are purple. How many are heterozygous? Well, so what do we know? We are saying that 99% of these are purple. We know that purple is dominant, which means that all of these guys are here, 99% are purple. I don't know which ones are homozygous dominant and which ones are heterozygous, but I know, what I do know is how many of them are in fact homozygous recessive, and that would be 99%, that would be 1%, but we're not using percentage. So what we're doing over here is we're going to write 99 or 0.99 minus 1 would give me the value of, and this is my answer here is 0.01, because 99 was the same thing as saying 0.99 plus, so 1 minus 0.99 would give me 0.01. That's my Q squared. This right here is my Q squared. Now what I told you to do in the steps is to figure out what Q is. The only way I can figure out Q is to take the square root of 0.01. The square root of 0.01, if I did this correctly, my math should be 0.1. So in order for me to calculate P, in order for me to calculate this value, I need to take 1 and subtract 0.1. And if I do that, my answer then becomes 0.9. Oops, apologize. This is my answer. 0.9. Once I have solved that, once I have 0.9, all I have to do is work my way down the equation. So p squared would be the same thing as saying 0.9 squared, which, if my calculations are correct, is 0.81. This is p squared. And 2pq, and I'm sorry, I'm running out of space. The answer for 2pq would be 2 times 0.9 times 0.1. And if I do this correct, my answer is 0.18. And so there it is. 0.18 is in fact my 2pq. And my question then, let's go back to the question for a minute. The question is, what is the percentage of heterozygous individuals? If I look again, it's 0.18 or 18%. So that's a classic example of how these Hardy-Weinberg equations are going to show up. And that's basically what we would do. We would solve it just like that. And the answer here being 0.18 or 18%. So the uses of it, again, is to determine how populations are changing from one generation to another, how the genes are being changed. We're about 10 minutes away from ending, so I want to make sure that I just check, make sure that people are still answering questions. Looks like we're good. Okay. Let me go back. Clifford, everything okay so far, Clifford? Just want to make sure that we're good before I move on to the last piece. Or Christy, everything good? Choi, we're hanging good? Okay. Let me go on to the last little pieces right here. We're going to talk about phylogeny and phylogenetic trees and cladograms, which are graphical representations or models of evolutionary history that can be tested, and particularly cladograms can be tested. Those are hypotheses. Let me go ahead and open this up. Okay, so the last few slides here are about cladograms. And this is how you put together organisms or things, really, items, based on common characteristics. You determine the number of characteristics and you arrange them in a form that shows the most possible commonalities. There are two types of data. One of them is through characters, like physical traits, and the other one is, of course, the more common one that we're using now, which is protein or DNA sequences. Here is an example of vertebrate phylogeny. Good Lord, this is complicated, but it's beautiful to look at the relationship between all of these living organisms, or even some that are no longer living, extinct organisms. So we have the fact that hippos are related to dolphins and whales, much more than, say, for example, the carnivores down here, such as foxes and wolves, and much more, say, than camels or zebras. Okay, this is the complete phylogeny. Holy crowd, that's overwhelming, but it's beautiful. Everything is crowded in. And again, like I explained earlier, what we have here is we have a situation where we have, let me just go to the pointer here to show you. Here we have the last universal common ancestor, the last universal common ancestor. And if we look here, we have bacteria. This is all bacteria, all of these things. My God, it's massive. And then we have this split here. So these are going to be archaea right here. And here we're going to have eukarya. And in eukarya, we have, this is obviously a very, very condensed version. If we were to look, this would be massive. But here we go. Humans are right over here. Homo sapiens. This is us right here, right next to DuPont troglodytes, so right next to chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, and particularly Paniscus. So here we are. Here's another one, and this one is just for dogs. And look how incredibly busy this gets. But again, we have wolves as our common ancestor here, and then we have this splitting up, and here you can see who's more closely related to others. Okay. The way that you do this phylogenetic tree, how you build these things, is going to be determined by the similarities and characteristics, and we should be using this maximum parsimony, the idea that if all things being equal, the simplest answer tends to be the correct one here. So here's one. For example, we have These characteristics, we're going to look at opposable thumbs, 4 chambers in her heart, amniotic eggs, lungs, and spinal column. And so chimpanzees have all of those things. Chimpanzees have opposable thumbs, they have 4 chamber hearts, they have amniotic eggs, they have lungs, and they have a spinal column. A mouse, on the other hand, does not have opposable thumbs, but they have the other remaining 4. A turtle does not have opposable thumbs, does not have a 4 chamber heart, but it does have an amniotic egg. They have lungs and they have a spinal cord. Frogs, on the other hand, do not have amniotic eggs. Their eggs are laid in water, and they do have lungs and they do have a spinal cord. Fish have all of this, but they do not have lungs. Sorry, and they do have a spinal cord. And finally, you have a lamprey, which is a jawless fish, and they have none of these things. They don't have a spinal cord. And so when you put these things together, when you have, it's important that you realize that you can revise these things as more information comes to be. And right now, computers are the way that they're putting these together. If you were to do this, if you were to create this table, what you would have, let me show you really quick how I would do this. And go back to this whiteboard. Let me erase this whole mess. And let's use this as a way to do it. The way I would do it would be to create a tree that looks something like this. And the way that I would put together is, here we have the chimp. That was the last thing in there. And this chimp had something that was new, and that would be the opposable thumbs. And then we have the mouse. Now, everybody after the opposable thumbs is that way. The mouse, on the other hand, what they had in here was they had a 4-chamber heart. So I would go in here and I would put this as a 4-chamber heart. And then after the mouse, we had, I believe it was the frog, right? Oh, it was a turtle. So then I would do the turtle here. Here's my turtle. And what the turtle had was lungs, I believe. No, amniotic eggs. Yeah, amniotic eggs. So I would go here and put amniotic eggs. And then after the turtle, we had the frog. And what the frog had in here, they had lungs. We're gonna need one more. And then over here we have the lamprey. Right? Everybody here after the frog has lungs. Everybody after the turtle has an amniotic egg. Everybody here has a 4-chamber heart. Everybody here has a opposable thumbs. And so what you end up doing is you're creating a situation where you can explain the relationship of these organisms. I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, there are tons of videos on how to make these things. And I know we're running out of time here. So now let's talk about speciations and what in fact is a species. The most commonly used description of what a species is a group of organisms that are capable to successfully reproduce. It's simplistic. It's not always 100% accurate, but it is the way that most things are going to be. Speciation can happen in 2 ways. There are 2 proposed ways. One of them is gradual, sort of these slow-moving things that happen over time. Another one is to have this punctuated equilibrium, which very, very fast periods of time where evolution happens very fast, very rapid, followed by evolution. So very change followed by rapid change. And both of these have been shown, demonstrated statistically to actually have happened. There have been some major extinctions. At this point, we believe it's either 5 or 6, depending on how you're using it, where life on Earth has almost, and large proportions of life on Earth have been extincted. Okay, and the last one, of course, is 65 million years ago, where we have this situation. And if you don't remember that one, that's the time when the dinosaurs became extinct through a meteorite to the effect of it. We also think of adaptive radiation, such as cichlids, mammals, the Galapagos finches, where you start with a single species and over time you end up going into you radiate out because different environmental conditions or contingencies allow you and the people that have your genes, organisms that have your genes, to be more successful. So the process happens in 1 or 2 ways. One of them is allopatric and sympatric. Allo meaning different, patric meaning place or country, different places, and sympatric, same country in the same area. So allopatric here, so you have an original population for both of these. And allopatric, there's something that changes it, and over time, these populations become 2 different populations because you have differences that created that, physical barriers. In a sympatric, the same country, you just had a genetic differences in here, and over time you developed two different populations here, but you didn't go anywhere. So allopatric in different country and sympatric in the same place in the same country. There's some specific barriers. So before for organisms to reproduce, these are specific barriers for organisms to be successfully reproductive. Some of them are physical, like some birds cannot reproduce with other birds from a different island because they can't cross to that island. Some of them can be temporal, having to do with time, like some flowers bloom at a certain time and other flowers bloom separately. Some of them can be behavior, such as the dancing, mechanical, such as that part that sexual reproductive organs cannot reach each other, or some of them are chemical. And then after, you have pozygotic. If they did have sex and they were successful, there's some other pozygotic barriers. So reduced viability, the offspring does not survive. Reduced fertility, the organism cannot have babies or offsprings of their own, so they're no longer able to reproduce, or hybrid breakdown. Here's an example: is mules. Most mules are in fact steriles. That's when you combine a horse and a donkey. It's an incredibly useful animal, but it's one that cannot be reproduced on its own. Mule and another mule, almost 100% of the time, will not be able to sexually reproductive. Apples is another way. Fruit fly, we've seen this kind of stuff, so I'm going to skip it for now. And I know we're running out of time. Lactose intolerance is a great way to look at evolution and two different events that led to the evolution of the capacity to continue to ingest milk even into adulthood. So finally, the origin of life, because I know we're going to run out of time. So the origin of life, there are two major ideas. Panspermia is that it came from extraterrestrial life. This is actually what most biologists that I speak to believe now. And then there's abiogenesis, which life came out of non-living things. We have hypotheses, but we can't really tell. Some of that hypothetical work was done by a couple of really important researchers, including for sure Miller and Urey. And again, we have this tremendous relationship between organisms. We know that the extinction of life happened around this time. We have, this is the Miller-Urey experiment right here, if you're not familiar with it. So my time is up. I don't want to take much longer than this. There are some credits in here that you might want to look at. And I did have some sample questions here from for example, 2019 free response question, where we have all of these primates here: gorilla, orangutan, gibbon, and chimpanzee, and DNA sequences. And eventually what you had to do with that is create a phylogenetic tree. If you have any questions, clearly, please reach out to me. I am on Twitter at upegihara. I'm also on Facebook, upegihara. And tomorrow is the next session. It's at 1 p.m. It's going to be a quantitative skills, and the info is linked below. So this one, I'm going to leave you with this kind of funny thing here. Evolution, according to religion, is creationism, not evolution. And according to people, the History Channel, science, this is actually what we're looking for here, right? So I hope that our discussion today has been helpful to some extent. I know I covered a lot of stuff, and I apologize for rushing through it. It is important that, again, you understand and value the fact that science is dynamic, it's changeable, it's always growing, and you as a student can be part of that answer. I hope that you're inspired to go learn stuff, to go challenge the standing structures that are there now, and you can find solutions for the problems that we have created in this world. Thank you so much for your time. Again, if you have questions, please email me, let me know. Okay. Thank you so much for our moderators, Clifford, Christy, Choi. I really appreciate you guys willing to help me. And if there's anything that comes up, by all means, reach out. Thank you so much, and have an awesome weekend.